particularly around community building and support of things outside the sort of research infrastructure space. And one of the themes that came from that discussion in that workshop, and as well as from later reflections that we recorded from many of you, was that a lot of people wanted some help either with collaboration or with innovation. And some of that might have been around sort of providing forums for having conversations with people that you don't normally get to talk to. And some of it might have been around trying to provide some sort of professional development opportunities that help build some of these skills that some of us, don't feel so confident with. So this event, Convergence, is really our response to that feedback and our first step towards trying to help with some of these things. So what I'll do now is I'll just share my screen again, if I can. Bear with me. There we go. And just give you a quick sense of what we're hoping to do today and how we'll format the next couple of days. So look, in a minute, I'm going to introduce you all to Associate Professor Leah Heiss from Monash, who's going to run us through today's program, really. So she's going to give a keynote in a minute, and then she's going to lead us through a workshop this afternoon. And as I said, I'll introduce her properly in a minute, but I'll say now that we're really excited to have Leah here with us today. She brings a wealth of experience, but a really different lens to the one that I think most of us as scientists are used to looking at collaboration and innovation with. And that's a sort of a design-focused, background. So I think today's going to be really, really important and useful for all of us. So I thank Leah for joining us. Then tomorrow, we're also going to have a similar sort of program. So we'll start with a panel discussion, but tomorrow's going to be a bit more inward focused. So the panel will be a number of AuScope researchers, many of whom you will know, and they'll be reflecting on their experiences of innovation in their science domains. And we're going to follow that with a workshop. We're going to get you all to help identify things that AuScope can do for this community to help, facilitate innovation. Support better collaboration, or whatever it is that you think we should be doing outside of just helping to support research infrastructure operation. And so we're going to make a commitment to investing in whatever comes out of that discussion tomorrow. There'll be an action item for us, and we'll report back to you as a community on how we're progressing on that. So it is an important discussion. We want you to be involved, and we want you to feel like you're being heard, and what we're putting forward is something that you actually want. And look, just really briefly, I thought I'd really just touch on the context for AuScope of collaboration and why it's so important. All of you, I think, were probably involved in helping us develop our 10-year strategy. And in that document, we described our vision, which is to help enable a sustainable and resilient nation through predictive geoscience. And our mission, which is to build an integrated and collaborative research platform that services and facilitates theoretical and applied geoscientific research. So that's the foundation of what we're trying to do. But there's been a whole bunch of activity recently at a whole bunch of different levels of government and in the areas that we operate that's sort of helping frame further that sort of big strategic piece. So one of those things is the NRI roadmap, which you're all aware came out last year, and that's going to it's identified a series of challenges and step changes that are going to influence how future research infrastructure investments take place. But alongside that, there's developments within some of our partner organisations like ARDC, who are developing their Planet Research Data Commons. This is something that's going to impact many of our projects. So all of these things are going to influence how we collaborate externally and internally. In the broader context, there's also documents like the Transforming Australia SDG Progress Report. And look, this is a really important document because it helps us navigate the challenges we're facing. And, some of it doesn't make for a very pleasant reading, but it's a really important way for us to look at the science we do in a broader context and understand whether we're actually having an impact that's meaningful to society. And finally, there are a number of other documents that have been published by the government and the Academy of Science, like the Critical Minerals Strategy that came out this year. And all of these help frame these big sort of challenge pieces, which for our communities are things like critical minerals, energy, sustainability of food and water, and impact of geohazards. We also have a really complex collaborative environment in which we work, right? So, we've got 25 partners across the country, and we work with Geoscience Australia, we work with CSIRO, we work with all of the state and territory geological surveys, CRCs. We work with all the other NCRIS organisations, including TERN and IMOS and NCI and ARDC and APPF and PAWSI. And we work with a whole bunch of these international collaborators as well, like EPOS and IRIS and the USRA, EarthCube, UNAVCO. So this is a really complex environment, and it's really important for us to work out how we can collaborate better amongst our group, amongst our community, and beyond our community into these other organisations or with these other organisations. Excuse me. And then finally, we also need to recognise how complex scientifically the AuScope array of infrastructures are and programs. So we've got field-based observational arrays, we've got sophisticated analytical laboratories, we've got data repositories, analytics, simulation codes. It's a really complex ecosystem of projects, and it presents an enormous opportunity for collaboration and innovation, but also a really challenging environment in which to do it because of the fact that we're all distributed around the country. So we're going to hear about some of those things tomorrow, but really what our focus is on over the next couple of days is how do we join up those little dotted lines in this diagram, and how do we actually make meaningful connections across these different programs. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I'll just give you a couple of notes about the next couple of days to be aware of. So as I said, we're recording this presentation, and we'll record all the keynotes, and we're going to distribute that to you all later so you can look at them later. We'll also write up a reflection piece about the workshops as well. So you will be able to see where we landed if you can't attend all of it. We will require that you take a pen and paper into the workshop in an hour's time so that you can write some notes down. If you have any questions or comments during the course of the event, please put them in the chat window. We're going to be monitoring that all day, and we will present those questions to Leah at the end of the keynote if we have time. And also, we're going to be using Slido a little bit to inform how we run tomorrow's workshop. So the link to that Slido will be put in the chat as well. So check in on the chat regularly. And finally, as I already mentioned, look, there's going to be an action that comes out of this for AuScope. So the meeting's important and the outcomes are important, and we will start to build something as a result of this. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we want to achieve and what we hope to get out of it. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Hopefully you can see me. And I think now Leah is visible as well. So now I have a delightful opportunity to introduce Leah to you. So Associate Professor Leah Heiss is the Eva and Mark Benson International Research Chair in Design at Monash University. She's a practicing designer and designer in residence at the Australian Nanofabrication Facility, another NCRIS organisation. She was the winner of the 2022 Australian Women in Design Award, and her design work has been recognised with 6 Australian Good Design Awards and the CSIRO Design Innovation Award. Through collaborative projects, Leah has brought human-centred design to hearing loss, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, mental health and loneliness. And Leah's work is part of the Museum's Victoria and Powerhouse collections and has been exhibited internationally to audiences exceeding 700,000 people. So now I'll hand over to Leah and she's going to take it from here. Thank you very much, Leah.
Thank you so much, Tim. That's fantastic. And thank you, really thank you for that overview. That was really wonderful. It really gave me a sense of the scope of AuScope, which is tremendous and very, very exciting. So I'm going to share my screen and it's going to go seamlessly and perfectly well, as it always does. I say with a little smile on the side of my face. Joe, big thank you to you for co-evolving today's workshop. Can you see design thinking to build innovation and cross-sector collaboration?
Yes, we can, Leah.
Okay, perfect, fabulous. So yes, as Tim mentioned, I'm an associate professor at Monash University. I wanted to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I come to you today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and recognise their continuing connection to the land and community and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. This is a little bit of a snapshot of my day job. So if you're wondering who on earth is this person that's been brought in to have a bit of a chat with me, the kind of work that I do is focused on designing wearable health technologies, systems and services to improve the lived experience of health systems. So while I don't generally work in the geological spaces, although I've dabbled a little bit in that space, I'm really looking at large complex systems, large complex organizations, and how we can improve collaboration across those organizations and systems through design-only means. And so the kind of work that I do is designing wearable health technologies, speculating on the future of technology and sensing, particularly in the healthcare domain. I do a lot of co-design work in health systems. So in the top right, that's a toolkit that I'll talk about a little later, which is around bringing people together to create common ground and common understanding. I also do a bunch of work, sort of participatory work and focus groups and interviews in environments like aged care to understand what the lived experience of health systems might be. As Tim mentioned, I exhibit my work. So that sort of exhibition piece is interesting because it's a different format and a different outcome to a commercialized outcome, but it tells stories. So how might you tell the story of collaboration, at a global scale? There's lots of different pathways and conduits for that. And I do a little bit of this stuff either online or face-to-face. So speaking about the power of design in improving the lived experience of systems. Throughout my career, I've been embedded in scientific and medical organizations for over 5 years. And I was with Nanotechnology Victoria for about 18 months in the late 2000s, in the Olivia Newton-John Cancer and Wellness Centre for a year, in the Centre for Advanced Materials and Performance Textiles for about 18 months, with a hearing aid company, with Cyro, although I was supposed to be there for 2 years, but never got past the car park because of COVID. And most recently, I've started working with the Australian Nanofabrication Facility. And the interesting thing about that, and perhaps the parallel to AuScope, is really looking at how do we enable this kind of design uplift across a very large distributed organization. And when I think about design uplift, I'm just talking about the ability to think flexibly about challenges, the ability to prototype, small experiments at scale that bring people together and create common ground. So I'll keep you informed about how that's going because it just kicked off last week. I'm located in the MADA school, so the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture. And I'm in the Design Health CoLab, which really focuses on doing translational research in product design, systems design, UX, UI, communications design and co-design. And so we do a bunch of things, including a Genaris bionic eye project. In the top, just over from that is the hearing aid that I designed for Blamey Saunders, toolkits and developing big co-design projects to improve collaboration, but also to redesign health challenges and health experience. And we're working in asthma, so a whole bunch of things. The key thing, I suppose, is around this, we think of a kind of a humanity-centered approach to complex health challenges, whether they be at the technology scale or at the system scale. So I'm losing my voice a little tiny bit, so I'll have to, continually drink from my warm water here. I think I thought might be useful today is over the years and through my PhD and 15 years of practicing as a designer, I've evolved a bit of a toolkit of approaches that I bring to complex challenges that enable me to stay quite agile. And this toolkit, at the moment, it contains about 7 tools, but I've sort of focused in on about 5 of them today. And I thought that it might be useful to tell a couple of stories around those tools and to get you thinking about, as you're listening to me, what are the tools that you have in your own toolkit or in your own backpack that enable you to keep the big issues in mind while you're focusing on the details? And that, how do we how do we kind of collectively and collaboratively think about ways and strategies to improving our collaboration across disciplines and sectors? And so the tools that I'll talk about today and the approaches are around reframing the challenge. And that's something that we'll delve into later in the workshop, going wide for inspiration, prototyping semi-solutions, building new languages across disciplines, and empathizing to find common ground. And all of this and these funny little stories that I have over 15 years of practice foregrounds the work that we'll do this afternoon together, which is really looking at, what are the practical strategies that we can bring to this challenge of improving our ability to collaborate across and beyond AuScope. So buckle up, we're going on a little journey. So the first one that I wanted to talk about, and this is a very short story, but it's about the idea of reframing the challenge. So we're confronted on a daily basis, and I'm sure you are, with problems and challenges. And it's very tempting just to say, that's a problem, it's locked, I'm going to respond to that problem, and I'm going to develop a solution for that problem. But spending a little bit of time in what designers like to call the problem space and being a bit flexible about the problem can be quite useful, and asking different types of questions. So I wanted to tell a small story or a short story on balancing competing needs. And this is really around how do we understand a challenge from our own perspective, but simultaneously understand it from the perspective of our collaborators or from other people in the ecosystem. So about 5 years ago, or maybe it was 6 years ago now, I started to work on a new kind of cardiac Holter monitor with St. Vincent's Hospital and the Nossal Institute for Global Health. So we were aiming to create a human-centered technology to replace what at the time was the current off-the-shelf, most used Holter monitor, to decrease both the stigma and the discomfort. And the technology that was widely used at the time looked like this, around 6 to 12 sticky electrodes that were stuck all over your body and a pager that you wore around your neck. And patients were trying to wear this for about 24 to 48 hours. They were trying to sleep in it. It was, had lots of dangling wires, pretty uncomfortable. My husband had to wear one for 48 hours and, he didn't get much sleep. So as a designer, during my research for the project, I spent a lot of time with the cardiac technicians at St. Vincent's to understand their processes and their requirements. And I remember saying to them at the time, how do you get good data from these things? Do they work? Talk me through it. And the cardiac technicians said to me, there's this fantastic product. It's by 3M. It's a skin sandpaper. And we sand the skin and we get a fantastic connection of the sticky electrode on the skin. The cardiologists are so happy with the data and my job is done. Tick. And I said, well, that's really interesting because I was spending a lot of time in aged care at the time. And all I was hearing from the residents, from the nurse unit managers, was how hard it was to get these sticky electrodes off. And anyone that spent time in aged care or has an elderly relative knows that very, very old skin is very, very delicate. And the nurses in the aged care facilities were telling me that the electrodes were so well stuck on that they often caused skin irritations, abrasions, and in the worst case scenario, they could also cause skin tears. And if you know anything about aging, a skin tear on a very elderly person can lead to infection, and infection in the worst scenario can lead to death. So we had this situation where, yes, the technology was working really well, but the lived experience of the technology was really not working well. And this fellow here, we'll call him Graham, and I don't think I should swear in this context because you're a lovely group of people, but basically said, it takes me 8 to 10 days to get the bastards off. So I meant to say buggers, but anyway, I swore. But yeah, so the data was excellent, but human experience was definitely not good. And so we started to work on a long wear device for people who'd suffered a heart attack or who have heart arrhythmia. And the joule structure housed the microcomputer, and the battery capability was in the little joules, and the wiring was all integrated into this band that was developed over 18 months with a team of weavers and a team of engineers. And the idea was that people wore this to 10 to 14 hours a day, and they recharged at night. So we created a longer wear device. And this is one of the things that will come up a lot today is the idea of what are the trade-offs. So we traded off fast, good data for long, not so good data that could be cleaned up through signal processing and provide the same level of information, but over a longer window of time. But this isn't really about data. It's not about jewelry. It's not about necklaces. It's about how do we use design or creative thinking or just pushing that envelope a little bit to reconcile the technical or clinical needs with lived experience realities. But also, how do we understand our challenges from our own perspective? How do we understand them from the perspective of our collaborators and from the perspective of the recipients of your innovation and brilliance? So there are people, systems, services, groups that benefit from what you do. And how do you understand the world from their perspective and integrate that into the way that you think about and frame problems and challenges? And at the end of this project, while it didn't become a commercialized outcome, the thing that was very useful around it was this idea of, reframing the question. And the question to me became, why can't a necklace detect a heart attack? And it actually can. Or, what can we do that enables us to understand the problem or the challenge from a different perspective? And then by developing a feedback mechanism, what happens if I tell the cardiac technicians about what I'm learning in aged care, and hopefully build a bridge between those very different groups? Okay, so my second story is really around going wide for inspiration. I think we've all had the experience of feeling a bit stuck and saying, I need a solution to a challenge. The challenge is A, solution is just not coming to mind. And what I like to do in these situations, in my own practice and in the students that I teach, is to think about how do we open the window a little bit wider? How do you get inspiration from elsewhere? And this is a story about getting inspiration in my practice from the geological sciences. So a number of years ago, I was asked to redesign or to design a brand new hearing aid. It was the first self-fit modular hearing aid for Blamey Saunders ears. And hearing loss is an enormous issue. 30% of the adults in the world suffer from hearing loss. And in 2008, the World Health Organization estimated that 360 million people in the global population suffered from disabling hearing loss. So a lot of people delay, and I'm sure everyone in the room knows someone that has hearing loss but doesn't want to wear a hearing aid. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. So cost, access, etc. One of the major reasons is stigma. So people don't start wearing hearing aids because they could be conceived as being ugly, associated with aging, etc. So I was thinking, well, that's the thing that I can focus on as a designer. How can I make a hearing aid look different? It'll function differently in order to bypass that stigma. And it was a fantastic piece of technology. So its intuitive magnetic connector bypasses the need to change tiny batteries. So that's an ongoing drama for people with vision impairment, tactile insensitivity, or what do we call it? Arthritis. But from a design perspective, I was sort of focused on shifting the stigma of hearing loss, to moving the technology from disability to desirability. And the reason that I thought about doing that was that if we could bypass the instinctual fear response we have when we're confronted by something frightening, like losing a sense, if we could evoke something else. And I guess in your context, people are terrified by, change to climate. Can we reframe that in any way to evoke a sense of curiosity or a different type of response that's not lockdown terror? So the mechanism for doing that in my own scenario and in the design of Facet, in order to dissociate Facet from languages of disability, so disabled beige, I sought inspiration from the mineralogy collection at the Melbourne Museum. And I spent a lot of time with Dermot Henry, the head of sciences, in the archives, digging around in the 70,000 specimens. And what I did with those specimens is that they informed the color, the texture, the clustering approaches, the surface texture, the kind of reflectivity of this hearing aid. And so in black, it was kind of like the SUV of the hearing aid market. It was quite matte. In white, it was kind of glossy and pearlescent. In rose gold, it was sort of coppery and shimmery and very attractive to, a certain subset of the community. It was very pretty. I've got some of these at home. While silver integrated into the hairline of people who had white or silvery locks. And the idea here was to kind of open the window of inspiration wider. What can I look at that's outside the field of medical technologies that might give me some inspiration in order to unstuck me? No, so, unstick me and get through these creative blocks. And I was focused on this idea of designing wearable health technologies that become part of our self-identity, not separate to it. So, the question here as an outsider might be, how does geological sciences and the work that you do become part of people's self-identity? How do you actually think, well, that's a part of my daily practice and my daily thinking. It's accessible to me. It's part of what I do on a daily basis. It's just kind of a big challenge. And the outcome of this particular story was a technology that sought to shift categories, from the medical to the personal, and using kind of creative strategies to help something shift categories. And this was shifting categories from being a device for disability to an emotional technology that people wanted to wear, wanted to engage with. And one of the markers of success for me was that at the launch of the technology, we had a 22-year-old woman who was saying, oh, it's just really pretty. I like to mix them up, and I mix them depending on the kind of jewelry I'm wearing on the day. Like I've got the module is this color and the other piece is this color. And that didn't seem like a big deal to anyone else. But for me, that was really important because she wasn't seeing this as a medical technology outside of herself. She was seeing this as part of her own sense of self-expression. Okay, so zipping right along, this is very connected, this story. So this is a story on the role of prototypes as campfires. So prototyping semi-solutions, you're confronted by a big challenge. We're going to test this out this afternoon. What do? You wait for a big solution. I need the full answer to the full problem. The full problem's big, needs full answer, huge. Well, not necessarily. We've got to think about this incrementally, and you're all science people, so you understand the value of small experiments. So during Facet, we created about 200 models during the design process. And these were 3D printed in titanium, polymer, stainless steel, plastics. And what you see there is an iterative design process that spanned 12 months. And the ones at the top are early in the process. They're like, shape, form, texture. The ones in the middle row start to think about color. How does this thing go together? Where is what we call a rocker switch to turn it up and down? And the lower ones are me experimenting with, I think we want to injection mold this in a kind of silvery material. How can I approximate silver? So I was like printing in any metal I could get my fingers on. I think I want to have an incredible blue. That didn't get off the shelf because for various reasons, no one wanted to buy it. But, sort of like testing and experimenting. The other thing about this, that these models were acquired by the heritage collections in New South Wales and Victoria, and they're exhibited to 300,000 people. And the important bit about that was it started to dispel the myth that innovation is fast and pain-free. And I would say, the remit of a dude in a shed. Dude goes to shed, comes out with iPhone. So that's not how innovation works, as we know. Innovation is iterative, it's complex, and it takes time. And there was no way to argue with that when you could see 200 prototypes, that went from idea through to commercialized outcome. But in the Facet project, the other thing that I wanted to draw to our attention is this idea of what a prototype does. So a prototype can be an approximation of what's coming up in the future, but it can also be something that helps to build trust with collaborators and keep projects in motion. And I think a lot about this idea of small wins. That was initially an idea brought up by Carl Weick. We talked about, what are the smallest experiments, or the small win, what's the smallest experiment that I can do to get this project going, to test this with collaborators and to assemble people of like mind and create common ground. And so we use these prototypes every single week in interdisciplinary teams. And people would come with their various perspectives to the prototype. So what you see on the left-hand side there is an audiologist. So the person that's dealing with the Keyma mannequin, so that's an audiological mannequin, he's a signal processing engineer. And he is doing some basic trigonometry to understand the wind, noise, the angle of the hearing aid, and which direction the microphone's facing, doing some basic wind noise algorithm work to make sure that you're getting the best hearing experience. So he was coming to that prototype with his own perspective. We had someone from the audiological team who was looking at it for comfort and fit. And we had someone from the marketing team was thinking about, how do we actually get this to market? How do we talk to people about this story? And you had someone from the design team, which was myself, integrating all of this input, taking it away and revising and reiterating a new model and bringing it back the next week. And we would do this with mechanical engineers, signal processing engineers, electronic engineers, the audiology team, the marketing team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole idea that a prototype, the smallest thing that you can make, can become like a campfire that everyone comes around. And the great thing about that is that they start to forget their bitches and gripes. So I swear again, but you know, it happens. They forget about the problem that they had in mind as they were approaching the meeting. Like, I'm really not happy with how this is going. And they say, actually, well, that's really interesting. Take me through the new piece of work from this week. So that's how we use prototypes to cohese a group and continually to move forward. And the other thing that they're very useful for in participatory contexts, and we use these prototypes in focus groups, we test them with hearing aid users, and they operate as kind of nudges to share memories. So people would pick up a hearing aid prototype and they'd pop it behind their ear. And they'd say, I remember when I lost my hearing, it started when I was 13, and I'd like to tell you that story. And they invite you into that private world. So they shift alignments and they create trust, and they help to reframe failure as part of an iterative process. So thinking with a prototyping mindset is very helpful. And I make this joke, but it's kind of true that, you know, my parenting is a prototype, my cooking is a prototype, my job is a prototype. And it helps me to think flexibly about when things don't go right. There was a very big continual learning experience, and I can learn from that prototype and I can iterate it and I can try something a little bit new. I can nudge or adapt or tweak my approach. Okay, so getting towards the end, we want to think a bit about empathizing to find common ground. And we'll talk about this in the workshop this afternoon, and we've got some very tangible ways of doing this work. But I thought I'd tell a very short story on the role of prototyping to bring teams together. And that really builds on this last thing, that the smallest thing you can bring to a team can help to cohese that team and bring them together. And when I talk about teams, it might be, you know, someone from another external AuScope enterprise, someone that you're trying to find common ground with and build trust. So I do a lot of work in prototyping health systems in addition to prototyping technologies. And in 2018, I developed a tactile co-design method called the tactile tools. And the tactile tools are really designed to map complex health journeys while keeping in mind the lived experience of people who need to access care. So it's a set of tools. It's basically acrylic tiles that represent elements of a healthcare experience. So we have goals, we have roadblocks, we have workarounds, empathy, stakeholders, and pathways. And we co-create these personas that tell the story of people who are trying to access complex journeys of care. And that's very important that we co-create them with healthcare providers, so they're clinically factual and they're emotionally engaging. But the useful thing about breaking down journeys or breaking down complex problems into their constituent parts is that people can enter those complex problems in different ways, and they can feel empowered to do something about those problems. And what we found, we've used this technology or this technique with in its digital and its physical format with probably like 500 people now. In acquired brain injury, to co-evolve the guidelines for voluntary assisted dying in Victoria, for eating disorders with Alfred Health, depression in older adults across Australia, all sorts of really kind of complex, tricky areas. And what it does is that it helps people, particularly interdisciplinary teams, to come together and iteratively address complex challenges. And what we find by kind of recontextualizing complex challenges, so you are facing complex challenges every day, the question is, can you recontextualize them as embodied and playful or slightly creative? Because what we find, if you imagine a workshop around voluntary assisted dying, not a lot of laughing going on. But by recontextualizing that as a flexible, creative experience, people start to loosen up a bit and get creative with their solutions. And what we found, which is kind of an interesting aside, was that materials have affordances. So an affordance in design lingo is how the door handle tells you that it wants to be opened. So I've got a door handle, that has a handle. It tells me that it wants to be turned. A door handle that has a little thing for your fingers to go into tells you it wants to be slid. So the affordance of this technology or this approach or this method is around sliding. And sliding a roadblock, if I write a roadblock and my boss writes a roadblock, and I'm able to slide my boss's thoughts around, it's a much less political act than if I'm in a workshop with post-it notes and my boss has said, this is what I think the problem is, and I pick up their post-it note and I move it to the other side of the room. I'm actually making a political act. But this whole idea about sort of equitable decision-making with these sorts of techniques and approaches. So not this particularly, but how can you make that how can you create an equitable decision-making environment that enables the voices of all people at the table to be heard? Now, given the onset of COVID, we were challenged to move the whole thing online. And online, as you'll know now, because you're all sitting there multitasking, probably or probably not, or drinking coffee, as one of our, I can see, that looks good. We were challenged to move the tactility of the method online. And then it's like, how do you actually do tactile stuff online? And so what we started to do was evolve and prototype and test new approaches to mapping networks. And this is one that we developed with Alfred Health when we're trying to understand the networks of care around people who experience eating disorders. And we've also used this new approach in the detection and treatment of depression in aging in place contexts. And when we think about that idea of affordances, the affordance of going online means that we've been able to develop an online toolkit, and we've used this across states and territories and countries now. And so most recently with the WHO, to bring people together across 8 countries to understand what the lived experience of using and implementing WHO guidelines is. And the challenge that was put to me was WHO guidelines are written by people in America, Europe, etc. They're used by people a nurse on a moped in Zambia. And there's a big disjunct between the people that are writing and the people that are trying to use. And how do we develop a whole series of what we're doing is we're developing a set of principles to guide all creators and a toolkit to guide all creators of WHO guidelines so that they can have that lived experience of the people that are trying to use the stuff in their daily practices. So when we think about that idea of affordances, I'm going to make a prototype. I don't know exactly what it is in your context, but I'm going to make a prototype. I'm going to bring it to this interdisciplinary team. It will help us to cohese and move forward. I'm then going to think about, how can we use that to push this challenge forward? Okay, so very last point here is, in order to establish and maintain, as you all know, really excellent interdisciplinary relationships across complex sectors, you almost need to build new languages. And the role of a designer is often that, as a translator between different disciplinary groups. And, this point in my career, I've been doing this stuff for about, 15 or so years, maybe a bit more, 17, I don't know. But, I work with all sorts of people, signal processing engineers. I work with emergency medicine clinicians. I work with people that develop the apps and people that do this and that. And I can't know all of those technical languages, but I can know enough of those languages that I can be a translator at the midpoint. And so that's the idea of kind of bridging the gaps. And how do we build the languages across disciplines that enable collaboration to occur and to flourish? So this very, very, very short story, and then we'll come to a close, follows on from the smart heart that I mentioned earlier, the necklace. During that project, I was embedded in an advanced textiles laboratory for 18 months. And I was working with a team of weavers, but I was also working with a team of engineers. And the project brought these diverse teams together, very different training, very different languages, different codes, different symbols. The big challenge of the project was to help the weavers integrate the engineering usability constraints into woven prototypes and to help the engineers understand the weaving constraints so that they could develop the engineering prototypes, and then to bring them all together into a cohesive whole. And the role of the designer was to prototype and iterate approaches, so prototypes, to building new languages between the sector experts. And I did a lot of diagramming and prototyping to enable the weavers and engineers to understand each other. And this is an example. These were large dendrograms on large-scale pattern paper. I had sort of unlimited access to large-scale pattern making paper, so very big diagrams, and that I loved. This one was really just looking at how do we creatively visualize all of the prototypes that we've done over time, and what was a dead end and what led to something else. So just an example. So I did a bunch of these and I tested them with the weavers and the engineers. But what we found was that the one-to-one scale plan, like if you think of a house plan, it's usually 1 to 100, 1 to 200, whatever, 1 to 500, and then your details are 1 to 10. These are one-to-one scale plans that we could print at 1-to-1, enabled the weavers to convert electronic requirements into picks per inch, warp tension, and weft structure, and help the engineers to understand the sensor locations, the power supply, etc. And so what you see in the picture in the top left is the head weaver using this plan at the loom as she was warping up. And what it had on it was, it basically said, you need to have one line of cotton, one line of electrical wiring, otherwise the whole thing's going to short out. One line of cotton, one line of, because so she was able to read it, convert it to her language. The engineers were able to read it and convert it into their language. So it's this sort of boundary object between the disciplines. So the learning here is about prototyping the artifact that enables conversations at the boundary between disciplines. What can I bring to the conversation that enables a conversation and trust to form? So I'm going to end there, and I'll just say that this afternoon we're going to drill into these in very practical activities, and we're going to do a bunch of activities around how do we develop better networks beyond AuScope, around defining and reframing challenges, empathizing with our collaborators, prototyping and testing some solutions, and then reflecting on this and applying it on a daily basis. And I would encourage you to just reach out. I'm on LinkedIn, or send me an email if you want to talk about anything. Thank you. Phew, 2 minutes over.
Well done, Leah. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to throw to Joe and see. We had a lot of comments in the chat, but I'm not sure if we had any specific questions. But I'll check in with Joe and see if she's picked up any.
No, nothing in this moment. Thank you. I've got some for you, Leah. I think Rebecca has a few as well. Give everyone a few minutes to populate some responses. Leah, that was so cool. I absolutely love it. Obviously, as a geoscience background and coming to design in recent years, I think that's so powerful. And maybe I'll throw something to you really quickly. First of all, about the boundary objects. I love the idea of a third piece in the middle that is that translator between different languages. What other kinds of boundary objects have you created or seen in your time that we could maybe draw some insights from?
It's a really good question. I mean, I wrote a paper on this, like, the role of prototypes as boundary objects, and there's a whole series of different types of boundary objects. And I guess, there's a lot in the literature around maps, actually. I think that's a really interesting thing in this space. The map and the territory, there's that conversation that goes on forever. But the idea, particularly in the geosciences, that the map, the visualization, the data visualization, the way of embodying the data in a format that enables people to access it and have a conversation, I know is like continually evolving. And when we think about those really big, large data sets, how do you enable them to be engaged with by multiple audiences and multiple perspectives? But I guess the main thing with boundary objects, I'm always thinking about what is the smallest thing every single day? Like, what is the smallest thing I can do, I can bring to this to enable a conversation to form? And as Richard Blewett pointed out, it really is around this How do we develop mutual respect and trust in order for people to mutually engage? And in some of my other talks, I talk about how do we actually enable that trust to form. And I draw from a framework that was developed by Sarah Pink, who's an ethnographer here, that talks about any engagement is a trust building exercise. And you think of it as, if you think of it as a placemaking activity, then you think about it in a multi-sensory way. So you think about, if I'm trying to trust with my collaborators, I want to think about the smell of the room, that it's decent coffee, good quality biscuits. It's the smell, the touch, the taste, it's the whole thing enables an environment of trust to evolve. And that's very important in my space, because if I bring someone into a clinical environment, all of a sudden the power dynamic has shifted. You know, I'm basically the lab coat and they're the recipient of my brilliance. You know, it doesn't work. We need to create this sort of territory. So, you know, the boundary object might be the Tim Tams, actually, just thinking very laterally around it. But I can see there's a couple of hands raised. That's exciting.
There is. Malcolm, you're first in the queue if you'd like to ask a question.
Thank you. Great. I really enjoyed that. I'll just make a few comments on things that resonated with me before I get to a little question. So your comment about lived experience of systems is important. I mean, I completely agree. I see that all the time, where how to do something is worked out by people in silos, and why it doesn't work is because of it's in between the silos. They don't realize what other people are doing, and it doesn't get implemented. I've seen that so many times. So I'd just like to say that really resonates with me. I think you're absolutely right. I also think trust is so important in collaboration, and you mentioned that very well. And it's about, you can't just assume that, it has to be gained. It has to be slowly earned. And also the comment about new language. I mean, a lot of us in our discipline, it's not one discipline, it's many disciplines now together, and there are different languages in different subparts, and learning those languages is very important. And the fact that if we don't learn them is where, again, things fall down, because we don't understand each other. So I just wanted to say all those bits really resonated with me, so I thought that was great. Here's my little question. So a lot of your examples seemed to me that they were predicated on bringing different people together to answer an identified question or need. Some of the challenges we have in the geosciences is sort of, I think, a little bit before that. We have interests in processes, and identifying the important question is a crucial part of science, and trying to identify that across different people with different skill sets and different languages is itself really difficult. And I just wanted to sort of wonder if you had thoughts about that, because it seemed to be that was like a pre-stage compared to many of the examples that you mentioned. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually the work I'm doing at the moment is a huge strategic initiative called Future Hospital, Future Health, which is, you know, what is the future of distributed healthcare going to be, and how can it become more centered around the needs of those who give and receive care and the ecosystems in which that care is being delivered. So decreasing impacts on, you know, climate, etc. And that's very much around that, like, how do we actually define the problem? And so I think while I've presented things where I knew what the problem was, you know, administering my projects, a lot of them were around that, you know, we need a better system for delivering care, we need a better technology for this or a better technology for that. I think that huge systems piece, and that when we're addressing something that is much more amorphous, some of these approaches still can be quite useful. And I think perhaps the first one is, and I just sort of developed it, I worked with it this morning, was what is the smallest thing that we can put in the room to enable people to come together and to start to build a definition of what that challenge might be. And so the way that we're doing that is I've got a working group that's robotics, neurosciences, IT systems, health ethnography. Like, it's a hugely diverse working group with very, very, very different languages. And so we're building, what we're talking about is like, we've come to the point where we recognize that there are tectonic plates, and that what we're trying to do is build the bridges. And we're like, what's the smallest bridge? You know, how can we, sometimes you got to open the window and sometimes you got to close it. We're like, the problem's so large that we've got to drill it in slightly. And so then we put a prototype out there, which is, we think that a pilot for older adults with multiple morbidities, et cetera, could be interesting. And it's around, how do people tell their stories over and over and over? How do they navigate silos? So that's the prototype that you put out there, or the campfire, and then getting input from all of those people. So I'm not sure if that's valid, but or to your situation, but I think that sense of, you always, even if you don't know the shape of the problem, you always need to think in a sort of small wins way. What's the smallest thing I can do? Because otherwise the problem, it just remains huge. And for me, it's that, you know, what little piece can I chip off so that I can keep moving? I wrote my whole PhD with a Pomodoro, you know, like 25-minute blocks. And that was that thing of like, it is enormous. It's a 4-year challenge, but 25 minutes at a time, I can manage. So I guess that's the thing, you know, how do you give definition to things that don't have definition? And what's the smallest thing? Who do I need in the room in order to shape something? You know, get them to the potter's wheel. That would be sort of my feeling about that. I mean, I'm yet on to really evolve my thinking, because I'm on that journey too. Thank you. It's excellent.
Thanks, Leah. Great answer. We've got a couple more questions. We've got one from Louis, and then there's one online, and then we'll go to Penny, but I'll go to Louis first.
Hello, and thank you very much. I very much enjoyed that journey. And a little bit like Malcolm, I think Malcolm and I work in similar areas in some ways. So what resonated with me was your conversation about the affordances that objects have, and we come across that very sort of similar idea, because a lot of what we do is in software development, and so everything we're doing is reaching out to, you know, across some sort of divide of people who are not expert in what we're doing, and trying to make sure that you know, the way that they think is the way that the interface is written. So I very much sort of, that's the sort of thing that, you know, I spend all my time worrying about people doing wrong. So I would very much like at some point to expand this conversation, you know, outside of the idea of new collaboration, and just think about how we collaborate with our existing users to some extent, and build those kinds of the sort of things we assume about our users and stuff across the various bits of software we make and across our community. So if there was, it hasn't really led to a question, but the question would be, I'd love to know about your experiences in working sort of across these domains with technological solutions and all kinds of other stuff, and just hear a few more words about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important thing. And I think, you know, when I said reach out, I actually really mean it. Like, reach out to anyone here that wants to have a conversation around how we do this better. Interestingly, one of the people on my working group for Future Hospital is a really talented software engineer. And she said to me the other day, I just realized that I'm seeing the world on a screen, and that people who are doing the navigating out there aren't seeing the world that I'm seeing. So I'm designing the UI and the UX in a certain way, so it will be navigable. But they're actually just going to the doctor, going to the hospital, getting a thing. So they're navigating your journey in a flesh and blood way. And I thought even just that was really interesting. And how do we bring that in? So in the sort of design thinking way of thinking, we're always like, design thinking 101, I have a lot of issues with, because it's like empathize up front and then go and do whatever you want and then come back with a solution. Whereas we're always looking at what are these, it's more participatory. What are the people that need to be part of the conversation throughout the conversation and throughout the development? And so building a small task force or a stakeholder group that you're testing with all the time. And that's, you know, every 3 months, every 4 months, I've done this thing, what do you think about it? It's not finished. Is it working? Is it not working? So I think, that can be helpful. Like, who are the people that you could check your assumptions with, that can keep you grounded in some ways, and not, because we're so trained to focus on the thing that we know well and to do it in the way that we're trained to do. So that's one way, is just that, these feedback loops, making them tighter, more often, more engagement, more challenging for us, takes more time, but hopefully the outcome is more aligned to the needs of the recipients.
Thanks very much for that, Leah. Look, we've probably almost run out of time, and we've got a couple of questions in the chat still. So what I might do is, Penny, if you don't mind adding your question to the chat as well, and then we might get you just to reflect on some of these questions very briefly later in the session after our break, if that's okay, Leah.
Sounds great.
Awesome. So look, thank you. I was going to do a little reflection, but I guess we're running out of time a little bit. So rather than go through the copious notes I took over the last 40 minutes, I guess the one thing that I really picked out on for us was translation. Like, what you've been doing is using all these tools that are probably pretty novel to our community and providing a mechanism for translation. And that's something that I think that we need to focus on in the geoscience community much more than we have in the past. I think it's going to be forced on us by the funding bodies, but it's also forced on us by society and our need to do work that's relevant to our national needs. So I think understanding that translation piece is something that we're probably not very good at as a community, even though we operate in quite an applied space often. So I think that that's really important. And then finally, the thing, we talked about trust a lot, but part of that is that fear of failure, I think. Like you mentioned, that you loved the blue one, right? And nobody wanted to buy it. So, that's, in a sense, that's a failure, right? And I think that that's the other thing that we need to be okay with, like putting out ideas that are crazy and having them shot down and being okay with that, because we learn from that. So I think that that's a really another nice thing that I took from your talk, that it's okay to fail. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is, I guess it is worth recognizing that in our community, and as I presume every community, there are probably different levels of comfort with collaboration and with extending ourselves into this sort of more innovative space. And so maybe that's something that we can tease out a bit this afternoon in the workshop, because I recognize that there are some people in this community and on this call who are just amazing collaborators and innovators. And I mean, we probably all are, but some of us are probably just a bit gamer, right? And so I think it would be really nice for us to recognize that as well. So it's now 1 o'clock. We're going to take a break for half an hour, and then we're going to reconvene here, and we're going to run through the workshop this afternoon that Leah's prepared for us. So we're going to just put a placeholder up, and we'll see you all back here at 1:30, if that's okay. Thanks, everyone. See you in a bit.